Don't you dare touch my daughter again. Imagine this. You step out for just a few minutes, a quick trip for groceries. But in those minutes, everything changes. Your 7-year-old daughter, alone at home, is cornered by a man who thinks he has a right to enter your house. A man with no badge, no authority, just his own twisted sense of power. He slaps her across the face, and it's the moment that will ignite a fury you can't control. The neighborhood was quiet. Willowstone Bend, the kind of place where the world feels safe and predictable. It's the kind of place where neighbors wave as they walk by, where kids ride their bikes and play in the front yard. Ashton Brooks had left for just 20 minutes, enough time to grab medicine, some soup, and a few groceries. Mila, his 7-year-old daughter, curled up on the couch, wrapped in her blanket, her favorite cartoons humming low in the background. Everything was as it should be. But Ashton didn't know, neither of them knew, that in that brief moment, a storm was brewing on the other side of the door. It started with a knock. At first gentle, then more insistent. Mila, startled, tiptoed to the peephole and saw him standing there, Dennis Powell, the so-called HOA cop of the neighborhood. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but that fake badge clipped his belt told a different story. Mila froze, doing exactly what her dad had always taught her. Don't open the door for anyone, not even if they knock. But Dennis didn't care. The knock became a pounding, relentless and hard, shaking the frame of the door. Mila backed away, her heart racing, her small hands trembling. She stayed silent. She stayed hidden, just like her dad told her. But Dennis Powell wasn't the kind of man to take no for an answer. He circled the house, peering through the windows, muttering to himself. He knew Mila was inside. He knew Ashton was gone. And that's where he found it, the unlocked sliding door at the back. With a casual push, the door slid open like it was his home, not theirs. Mila screamed as he stepped inside, his heavy footsteps echoing through the house. She backed into the kitchen, trying to escape, but there was nowhere to go. "Why didn't you open the door for me?" he demanded, his voice cold, threatening. Mila stammered, voice shaking. "My dad said not to open the door for anyone but him." Dennis Powell didn't care about her rules. He didn't care about her dad's instructions. All he saw was a child who dared to defy him, and in that moment, he made a decision. He raised his hand, and without a second thought, he slapped her across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the house, the noise sharp, cruel. Mila's scream filled the air, a sound that would break any parent's heart. The moment the door slammed open, it wasn't just a noise that shattered the peace of the house. It was a fear. Mila's small body trembled as she stood cornered, unsure what this man wanted or why he was so angry. In that instant, she became his target, the victim of a twisted power play that left her feeling helpless, unable to understand why he was doing this. Ashton Brooks didn't know any of this. The world outside seemed calm, quiet. He had no idea that his daughter was facing the worst kind of intruder, a man who didn't belong, with no right to be in their home. All he knew was that he'd been gone for only a short while, just enough time to pick up a few things for Mila. He hadn't expected to come home to this. The groceries tumbled from his hands as he stepped out of the car, the quiet in the air too still, too unnatural. His senses screamed something was wrong. He looked at the porch and saw Mila standing there, her knees pulled to her chest, her small shoulders shaking as she wiped at her eyes, trying to hide the tears. Ashton's heart dropped. The grocery bag slipped from his hands, hitting the concrete with a loud crash. Ken scattered across the driveway, and a carton of eggs exploded across the ground. He rushed up the porch steps, dropping to his knees in front of her. "Baby, what happened? What's wrong?" She looked up slowly, and the sight hit him like a punch to the gut. His little girl, the one he'd promised to protect, had a bright red handprint across her cheek. It was fresh, clear, unmistakable. Her voice shook as she whispered, barely audible. He came inside. "I didn't open the door. I didn't. I hid." But he found the back door open. He yelled at me. He slapped me. The world around Ashton blurred. His breath caught in his chest, and the rage inside him grew so fierce he could barely control it. Every muscle in his body tensed as his blood ran hot. This wasn't just an injustice. It was personal. His little girl had been hurt, violated in the one place she should have felt safest. "Who?" he asked, even though he already knew. Mila hesitated, then mouthed the name, her voice barely a whisper. "Dennis." Ashton's blood boiled at the sound of the name. Dennis Powell, the neighborhood self-appointed HOA cop, a man who had made life hell for so many, had gone too far. He had crossed the line in the most unforgivable way possible, and Ashton wasn't going to let it slide. Ashton held Mila close, his arms wrapping around her like a shield. His heart pounded in his chest, and he fought to keep his voice calm. "You're safe now, Mila. He can't hurt you anymore." But his words were barely a whisper in the storm that raged inside him. The sight of that slap on her cheek, the fear in her eyes, it broke him in ways nothing else could. Mila's small body trembled against his. She clutched her stuffed bear tightly, her other hand pressed against the side of her face where the mark of Dennis Powell's cruelty still lingered. The room felt too small, the air too thick, and the world outside seemed so far away from the safety of their home. Ashton knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. It was about making sure no one else would ever suffer at the hands of a man who thought he was above everyone else. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down enough to think clearly. He stood up, his legs stiff, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Mila's eyes followed him as he walked toward the door. "Stay here, baby. I'm going to make sure he never does this again." But even as the words left his mouth, Ashton knew the gravity of the situation. Troy Powell, the so-called HOA cop, was no stranger to intimidation. He had terrorized the entire neighborhood for years, but this time he'd crossed a line that no one could ignore. He would pay for what he had done. Ashton didn't call first. He didn't knock. He didn't even wait for the right moment. He couldn't. Mila was hurting, and the man responsible was still out there. He stormed across the street with a single burning purpose. He reached Troy Powell's porch in a matter of seconds, his steps heavy with anger, muscles tight, vision narrowed to a single point. He was done waiting. Without hesitation, Ashton kicked the door with everything he had. The force of the blow rattled the wood, shaking the frame as if the whole house had been hit. "Dennis!" Ashton shouted, his voice low but thick with fury. "Open this damn door right now." The neighbors were already watching, peeking through blinds, their curtains twitching as whispers spread across the block. But Ashton didn't care. He didn't care about anyone else. Not right now. The door swung open, and there he stood. Troy Powell, arms crossed, his fake badge glinting in the sunlight, his jaw tight with arrogance. He looked like he owned the whole street, and in that moment, Ashton couldn't stand it any longer. "Well," Troy said, his voice dripping with smugness. This had better be important. Ashton's eyes narrowed. The calm, arrogant demeanor of this man, the same man who had hit his daughter, pushed Ashton to the edge. "What the hell did you do to my child?" he growled. Troy didn't flinch. In fact, he smirked. "She disrespected me," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I knocked. She ignored me. Kids today need discipline. I handled it." The words hit Ashton like a slap to the face. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Troy Powell actually thought he had the right to hit a child. To invade someone's home like that? "You broke into my house," Ashton said, stepping closer, his voice growing darker. "You put your hands on my daughter." Troy raised his hand dismissively. "Maybe if you taught her some manners, I wouldn't have to step in," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Someone has to keep order around here. That's my job." And that was it. The moment everything snapped. Ashton's fist moved faster than his mind could process. His punch landed square on Troy's jaw with a force so brutal, it felt like the earth shifted underfoot. The sound of the impact cracked through the porch like a branch snapping in half. Troy staggered backward, his legs wobbling as he tried to regain his balance. His back hit the wall, and he collapsed against it, clutching his jaw, screaming in shock and pain. You animal!" Troy shrieked, his voice rising in a frantic panic. "How dare you? You assaulted an HOA officer. I'm calling the police." Ashton stepped forward, his voice unnervingly calm as the fury burned inside him. "Already did." Troy's eyes widened. the fear flashing across his face for the first time all day. The neighborhood had witnessed everything. The whispers had already started. Neighbors had seen it all. The man who had terrorized them finally getting what was coming to him. The sound of sirens pierced the air, distant at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Ashton stood firm, his jaw clenched, his body still trembling with the adrenaline of what had just happened. Troy Powell was on the ground, clutching his jaw, still whining about being an officer and calling for police. But there was no sympathy in Ashton's heart, just a burning fury that had to be released. Neighbors flooded out of their homes, drawn by the noise, the chaos, the release of tension they'd all been holding in for so long. They watched as Troy Powell bullied them for years, harassing teenagers for skating, fining families for leaving their trash bins out too long, imposing rules no one agreed to. And yet, he had never faced any consequences. Not until now. Ashton took one last, steadying breath, looking down at the man who had dared to touch his daughter. "You're going to get what you deserve," he muttered, his voice like ice. He turned on his heels, walking back toward his house, the anger still bubbling beneath the surface. He had to be calm now. The battle was far from over, and he wasn't done yet. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb, the red and blue lights casting an eerie glow across the street. Officers stepped out, hands on their belts, scanning the scene. Troy Powell immediately hobbled toward them, playing up his theatrics, his voice rising with every word. "Officers, arrest him!" Troy shrieked, his face contorted with pain. "He assaulted me. I'm an HOA officer." One of the officers held up a hand, cutting him off. "Mr. Powell, please, calm down." The officer's tone was sharp, and Ashton could hear the disbelief in his voice. "What's going on here?" The other officer, a younger man, nodded in acknowledgement. "We'll need to hear both sides of the story." But Ashton wasn't interested in explaining. He wasn't interested in justifying what had happened. He knew what he had to do, without a word. He walked into his home and pulled up the security footage on the TV. The officers followed him inside, watching as the video played in silence. There, clear as day, was Troy Powell, circling around Ashton's house like a predator. He tested the windows, peered through the glass, and then made his way to the backyard. The camera angle shifted, showing him slide the back door open like it was his own home, stepping inside uninvited. Mila appeared on the screen, small and fragile, her eyes wide with fear as she backed into the kitchen, clutching her blanket. Her voice shook as she tried to explain why she hadn't opened the door, her words barely audible. And then, the moment that shattered everything, Troy Powell slapped her across the face, a grown man assaulting a terrified child in her own home. The officers stood shoulder to shoulder, their arms crossed as they watched, their eyes narrowing with every passing second. When the footage ended, a heavy silence filled the room. One of the officers exhaled slowly, his face hardening. "That's enough," he said, his voice sharp. "We'll take it from here." The officers stepped outside, their presence now more commanding, their steps purposeful. Troy Powell had gone too far. Outside, the scene had shifted. Troy's bravado had vanished, replaced by a sudden, desperate fear. The older officer addressed him, his voice firm. "Mr. Powell," the officer said calmly, "we reviewed the footage." He paused, allowing the weight of the situation to settle in. "You unlawfully entered a residence. You assaulted a minor. You're under arrest for trespassing, assault on a child, and endangerment." Troy's face went pale. His mouth dropped open, but no words came out. He stood frozen for a moment, then stammered, "Why, you can't do this. I'm the HOA president." "Not anymore," one neighbor muttered, and the crowd began to murmur in agreement. Troy Powell's reign of terror was over. The officer grabbed his arm, guiding him toward the patrol car. Troy protested, still shouting, still trying to maintain his arrogance, but no one was listening anymore. The neighborhood had finally seen justice. As the patrol car pulled away, Ashton watched. For the first time, Willowstone Bend felt lighter, like a heavy weight had been lifted. The sirens faded into the distance, but Ashton's heart still raced with the adrenaline of what had just transpired. He stood there on his front porch, watching the patrol car disappear down the street. The neighborhood was silent now, almost too silent, as if everyone was waiting for the final word, the one that would confirm what had just happened. Ashton slowly turned back toward his house, his eyes landing on Mila, who was sitting at the kitchen table, her stuffed bear tucked under her arm. Her cheek was still red, but her breathing had steadied. She looked up at him, her eyes tired, but there was something else in them now, a quiet strength, a resilience that made Ashton's heart ache. "Are you okay, baby?" he asked, kneeling beside her. His voice was softer now, trying to soothe the rawness of the day's events. Mila nodded, but she didn't speak. The words were still lodged somewhere deep inside her, the fear too fresh to put into words. Ashton could see the weight of it in her eyes, the way she had tried to protect herself, how she had followed the rules, and yet it hadn't been enough. He wrapped his arms around her again, pulling her close, feeling the smallness of her body, the warmth of her skin. "You're safe now, Mila. He's not coming back." The weight of the moment pressed down on him. Everything he had ever worked for, his family, his home, was nearly taken away in an instant. But what had struck Ashton the hardest was how someone like Troy Powell could think he had the right to take control, to instill fear in an innocent child just because he wore a fake badge. Ashton's hands tightened into fists again, the anger bubbling up, raw and uncontrollable. But it wasn't just a slap that had shattered something inside him. It was a violation of everything he stood for, everything he had taught Mila. He stood up, his mind racing, his thoughts consumed by the need for action. He couldn't just let this go. This wasn't the kind of thing that could be swept under the rug. The system needed to see this, needed to feel the weight of what Troy Powell had done, and Ashton would make sure of it. He would make sure Troy would never be allowed to hurt anyone else. But that wasn't the only thing Ashton had to think about now. He had to think about the neighborhood, about the other families who had suffered in silence, about the way Troy Powell had held everyone in fear for so long. The neighborhood needed to know what had happened today. They needed to see that justice had been done, and they needed to know that the person who had caused so much harm would finally pay for it. Ashton's thoughts were interrupted when the doorbell rang. He turned, feeling a momentary jolt of uncertainty. But when he opened the door, there were no officers, no more trouble. Instead, a group of neighbors stood on the porch, their expressions a mixture of surprise, relief, and, most surprisingly, respect. They didn't say anything at first. They just stood there, silently acknowledging the man who had taken action, who had stood up to Troy Powell when no one else had dared. One of the women stepped forward, her voice quiet but steady. "You did what none of us had the courage to do," she said. "Thank you, Ashton. You've given us all hope today." Ashton stood there, staring at them, the weight of their words sinking in. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't looking for thanks. He was just a father, doing what any father would do to protect his child. But as he looked around at the faces of the neighbors, faces that had watched for years as Troy Powell harassed and terrorized them, Ashton realized that this wasn't just about one man's actions. This was about the courage to stand up, to do what was right, no matter the consequences. And in that moment, as he closed the door and turned back to Mila, he felt a sense of calm wash over him, a feeling that he had done the right thing for his daughter, for the neighborhood, and for the future. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon as Ashton stood by the window, staring out at the quiet street. It was hard to believe that only hours ago his world had been turned upside down. The peaceful neighborhood he had come to trust had been shattered by a man who thought he was above the law. But now, the sound of the police cars had faded, and all that was left was a heavy silence of justice settling into place. Mila sat at the kitchen table, her bear still clutched tightly in her arms, her eyes now heavy with exhaustion. But even as she fought sleep, Ashton could see that she was no longer the same little girl. The innocence had been stripped from her that day, replaced by a wariness that could never be undone. Ashton's chest tightened at the thought, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't break down now, not when Mila needed him most. The front door opened, and Ashton turned to see the officers walking in, their expressions serious, their eyes hard. One of the officers, an older man, nodded to him. "We've reviewed the footage," he said, his voice cold and firm. "And it's clear what Troy Powell did wasn't just a violation of the law. It was an assault. A child was attacked in her own home. Ashton felt a weight lift from his chest, but only slightly. Justice was being served, but the scars would remain for both him and Mila. He led the officers to the living room, where the video footage played once again, the shocking evidence displayed for all to see. Troy Powell could be seen clearly on the screen, his figure circling the house, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement inside. When he reached the backyard, he found a sliding door unlocked and open, and without hesitation, he stepped inside as if he owned the place. The footage played out in real time, showing Mila's fearful reaction as she backed away from the intruder. She tried to explain herself, but Troy didn't care. He slapped her hard, the impact ringing out through the house. The officers watched the video in silence. Their eyes were hard, but their emotions were restrained. One officer clenched his jaw, the sound of Mila's scream clearly hitting him harder than he had expected. Ashton could see the tension in their faces, the unmistakable acknowledgement that they were witnessing a crime unfold. When the video ended, the room was heavy with silence. "Yeah, that's enough," the older officer said, his voice low but steady. He turned to the younger officer. "Let's get the arrest paperwork ready. We've got enough here to charge him." Ashton nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. For the first time today, he could breathe. For the first time in hours, he could think about the future, about what came next for him and Mila. The fear was still there, lingering like a shadow, but the knowledge that Troy Powell was going to face the consequences of his actions made the weight a little easier to bear. Outside, the sound of the neighborhood had shifted. Where once there had been whispers and uncertainty, there was now a strange sense of peace, a feeling that the balance of power had shifted. People had seen what happened. They had witnessed the fall of a man who had terrorized them for years, and they had seen Ashton Brooks stand up not just for his daughter, but for every person in the neighborhood who had lived in fear. Minutes later, the patrol car pulled up to the curb, its red and blue lights cutting through the fading daylight. Troy Powell, still limping and ranting, was escorted out of his house by officers, his face pale and his mouth open in disbelief. He had spent years acting like the law, like the rule of the neighborhood, but now the tables had turned. "You can't do this." "I'm the HOA president," he screamed, his voice rising as the officers guided him to the car. "Not anymore," one of the neighbors muttered under his breath. A few others nodded in quiet agreement. As the patrol car pulled away, the neighborhood stood still, watching as the man who had caused so much pain was driven away. For the first time in a long while, there was hope. Inside, Ashton closed the door quietly behind him, walking over to Mila, who had fallen asleep at the table, her bear still clutched in her arms. He knelt beside her, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "You're safe now," he whispered, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "He's not coming back." The street outside was quiet again, the normal hum of the neighborhood slowly returning. But for Ashton Brooks, the world had changed forever. The air seemed heavier now, like the weight of everything that had happened was still pressing down on him, making every breath a little harder to take. Mila, asleep at the kitchen table, had been through so much in such a short time. But at least, for the moment, she was safe. Ashton sat beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He looked at her small, peaceful face. Try to imagine how she must have felt in those terrifying moments when Troy Powell had entered their home. The anger in his chest stirred again, but he forced himself to stay calm, to focus on what mattered most now: healing. For the first time in a long while, Ashton felt the weight of fatherhood in a different way. He had always known that protecting his daughter was his responsibility, but now it felt deeper, like he had crossed a threshold. He had done what no one else in the neighborhood had been willing to do. He had stood up to the bully who had terrorized them all for so long. The thought gave him a sense of pride, but it was bittersweet. The neighborhood would never be the same. The man who had been their so-called authority figure was gone, arrested for what he had done to Mila. But Ashton knew that this victory wasn't just about getting rid of Troy Powell. It was about the power of standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. It was about showing Mila that justice could be done, even if it came at a cost. But justice was only the first step. The healing would take time, and Ashton wasn't sure how long it would take for Mila to fully recover from the trauma of that day. She had been so brave, so strong. But he knew that the scars of this experience would stay with her forever. Ashton sighed, rubbing his face as the weight of everything pressed down on him. He couldn't go back to the way things were before, and he didn't want to. But he also couldn't ignore what had happened, what they had both been through. Mila deserved to feel safe again. She deserved to grow up without the fear that someone might break into their home, that someone might hurt her simply because they thought they could. He glanced at the clock on the wall. The night was settling in, but he couldn't sleep. Not yet. He had to make sure Mila was okay, that she felt protected. Just then, he heard a knock on the door. Ashton stood up slowly, glancing down at Mila to make sure she was still asleep. He moved quietly to the door, unsure of who it might be. When he opened it, he was met with a familiar face, one of the neighbors from down the street. "Hey," the neighbor said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I just want to check in, see how you're doing. We all saw what happened, and, well, we want to say thank you, what you did today. It was something none of us had the courage to do. You stood up for all of us." Ashton felt a lump form in his throat, a mixture of pride and emotion he hadn't expected. He hadn't done this for recognition. He hadn't done it for any reward. But hearing the words of his neighbors, knowing that they had seen what he did, that they had witnessed him fight back against the tyranny that had plagued them, made everything feel worthwhile. "I just did what any father would do," Ashton replied quietly, his voice thick. "It's not just about me. It's about Mila. It's about making sure no one else goes through what she did." The neighbor nodded, his eyes serious. "We'll be watching out for you both, Ashton. This neighborhood's not the same without people like you." With that, he gave Ashton a quick nod and turned to walk back down the driveway. Ashton closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, his hand still on the handle as the weight of the day settled in once more. He returned to Mila, who was still asleep at the table. He gently scooped her up, carrying her to the couch, where he tucked her in with the same care he'd given her every night since she was born. "You're safe now," he whispered, brushing his hand through her hair as she settled under the blanket. "I promise you, I'll always keep you safe." The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Ashton knew that. But as he sat there, watching his daughter sleep peacefully for the first time that day, he felt a sense of peace settle over him too. It wasn't just about justice. It was about love. The kind of love that drives a father to protect his child no matter the cost. The kind of love that reminds you that no matter how dark the world gets, there's always a light waiting to guide you home. And for Ashton Brooks, that light was Mila. As the night fell quiet, Ashton sat in the stillness of his home, the weight of the day's events settling in. His daughter, Mila, was safe. The terror had passed. But the fight for justice for the future had just begun. If this story moved you, subscribe for more cinematic journeys from Black Rise. We believe in truth, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoyed today's story, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another pulse-pounding cinematic tale from Black Rise. Here's a quick question for you. Would you have done the same if it were your child? Sometimes, standing up for what's right takes more courage than we ever thought possible. And sometimes, that courage is exactly what the world needs.